The morning sun crept across the Wyoming plains like a hesitant visitor, painting long shadows through the broken slats of Thomas Avery's ranch fence. He stood on the porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the light reveal what 3 years of neglect had wrought. The fence posts leaned at drunken angles, some held upright only by the stubborn grip of prairie grass. Paint peeled from the barn walls in strips that curled like dying leaves. Even the wind seemed to move differently here now, no longer playful but mournful, keening through gaps in the boards with a sound that made him think of loss. Thomas took a sip of the bitter coffee and grimaced. He'd forgotten the sugar again. Sarah would have remembered. Sarah always remembered the small things that made life bearable. But Sarah had been gone 5 years now, taken by the fever that swept through the valley like wildfire. And Caleb. Thomas's hand tightened on the tin cup until his knuckles went white. 3 years since the boy's lungs gave out. 3 years since he'd buried his son beside his mother in the small cemetery plot behind the hill. The house behind him stood silent as a tomb. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced through unwashed windows. Inside, chairs sat exactly where they'd been placed years ago, gathering dust like memories. Caleb's room remained untouched. The door closed, a shrine to a life cut short at 12 years old. Sometimes Thomas caught himself listening for the sound of boots on the stairs, the slam of the front door as the boy raced out to check on the horses. But there was only silence now, broken occasionally by the settling of old wood or the skitter of mice in the walls. He forced himself to move, setting the cup on the porch rail. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. The cattle needed feeding. The water troughs needed filling. The endless repairs that kept the ranch from collapsing entirely into the earth. Work was what kept him moving, kept him from sitting in that rocking chair and never getting up again. The barn smelled of old hay and leather, familiar scents that should have been comforting but now only emphasized the emptiness. His horse, a patient bay mare named Buttercup, nickered softly as he entered. She was one of the few living things left on the ranch that remembered the better days. Thomas ran a hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath his palm. "Just you and me now, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Days could pass without him speaking to another soul. The nearest neighbor, old Pete Morrison, lived 5 miles east, and Thomas hadn't made that ride in months. He saddled Buttercup with movements born of decades of practice, his hands working automatically while his mind wandered. The ranch had once been alive with activity. 20 head of cattle, a dozen horses, chickens scratching in the yard, and Sarah's vegetable garden blooming with life. Now he kept just enough cattle to survive, sold what he could to buy supplies, and let the rest go to seed. The morning ride to check the fence line had become a ritual, less about actual maintenance and more about filling the hours between dawn and dusk. Thomas guided Buttercup along the southern boundary, noting without much interest where posts had fallen, where wire had snapped. He'd fix them eventually, or he wouldn't. It hardly seemed to matter anymore. The sun climbed higher, warming his back through the worn flannel shirt. October in Wyoming could be harsh, but this morning held a gentleness that reminded him of other autumns, when Caleb would ride beside him, chattering about everything and nothing. The boy had loved these rides, loved learning the business of ranching, the satisfaction of hard work under an endless sky. "See that hawk, Pa?" Caleb would say, pointing to a speck circling high above. "Bet he can see clear to Colorado from up there." Thomas blinked hard, dispelling the memory. These ghosts were both comfort and torment, keeping him company while reminding him of all he'd lost. By noon, he'd covered half the property line. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. Eating had become just another chore, fuel for the body that kept working even when the spirit had given up. He'd make some beans later, maybe fry some salt pork if he could muster the energy. Sarah's cast iron skillet still hung on the kitchen wall, but he used the smaller pan now. Cooking for one didn't require much. The afternoon stretched before him like an empty road. He'd already decided to leave the fallen fence posts for another day. Tomorrow, maybe, or next week. Time had become elastic, days blending into one another without distinction. Sunday felt like Tuesday felt like Thursday. Only the changing seasons marked the passage of time, and even those seemed muted now, as if the world itself had dimmed. Back at the ranch house, Thomas unsaddled Buttercup and gave her extra oats, a small kindness in a world that had shown him little of late. He stood in the barn doorway, looking out at the land that had once been his dream, 40 acres of possibility. Sarah had called it when they'd first arrived, young and full of hope. Now it felt like 40 acres of memories, each hill and valley holding echoes of better times. The house waited for him, silent and still. He climbed the porch steps slowly, each board creaking under his weight. Inside, the clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:17. He couldn't remember when. Caleb's arithmetic book still lay open on the kitchen table, pencil beside it as if the boy had just stepped away. Thomas had meant to put it away 100 times, but somehow never did. He heated water for coffee on the stove, going through the motions of living. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the east window. Another thing to fix. Another thing that would wait. He sat at the table, careful not to disturb the arithmetic book, and stared at the wall where Sarah had penciled marks to track Caleb's growth. The last mark was dated 3 months before the sickness came. Evening approached with the reliability of an old friend. Thomas knew he should eat something substantial, but settled for hard biscuits and the last of the jerky. He'd need to go to town soon for supplies. The thought filled him with dread. Town meant people, meant questions about how he was holding up, meant well-meaning suggestions that he should sell the ranch, move somewhere with folks around, but this land held his family, held his memories. Leaving would be like abandoning them all over again. As darkness fell, he lit the oil lamp and settled into his chair by the cold fireplace. He should build a fire, but the effort seemed too great. Instead, he pulled the wool blanket around his shoulders and picked up the Bible from the side table. It fell open to Psalms, the pages worn from Sarah's nightly readings. He tried to focus on the words, but they swam before his eyes, meaningless marks on paper. The coyotes began their nightly chorus somewhere in the distance, their calls echoing across the empty land. Once, that sound had meant danger to the livestock, sent him reaching for his rifle. Now he listened to it like a lullaby, proof that something still lived out there in the darkness. Thomas closed his eyes, not quite sleeping, but not fully awake either. In this twilight state, he could almost pretend things were different. He could hear Sarah humming in the kitchen, smell the bread baking in the oven. He could feel Caleb's small hand in his as they walked to the barn for evening chores. But these fantasies were dangerous, making the return to reality all the more brutal. The lamp flickered, running low on oil. He should refill it, but instead watched the flame dance lower and lower until darkness reclaimed the room. In the black of night, wrapped in his blanket like a shroud, Thomas Avery sat alone with his ghosts, waiting for a dawn that would bring only another day exactly like this one. He had survived loss, but surviving and living were two very different things. He was a man going through the motions of life while his heart remained buried on the hill with his wife and son. Tomorrow he would wake, tend the animals, ride the fence line, and return to this empty house. And the day after that, and the day after that, it was existence, not life, but it was all he had left. The ranch would slowly crumble around him, and he would crumble with it. Two relics of a happier time slowly returning to the dust of the Wyoming plains. The frost came early that October morning, silvering the grass and turning each breath into a small cloud. Thomas pulled on his coat, movement stiff from another night in the chair. His back protested as he straightened, reminding him he wasn't a young man anymore. 43 years had left their mark in aching joints and silver threading through his dark hair. He stepped onto the porch, squinting against the pale sun that struggled through a veil of clouds. The coffee would have to wait. Something felt different this morning, though he couldn't place what. Maybe it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way the ravens gathered on the barn roof. black shapes against weathered wood. Then he saw him. A small figure stood at the southern fence line, one thin hand gripping a fence post. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the boy swaying slightly, like wheat in a breeze. The child couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, dressed in clothes too thin for the Wyoming cold, too large for his frame. Thomas stood frozen on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The boy's hair caught the morning light, sandy brown, just like... He shook his head, trying to clear it. His mind was playing tricks. It had done so before, showing him Caleb and every young boy glimpsed in town, hearing his voice in the wind. But the boy remained, real and solid against the fence. Thomas descended the steps slowly, afraid that sudden movement might cause this vision to vanish like morning mist. His boots crunched on the frost-stiffened grass. 50 yards, 40, 30. The boy turned his head, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes, green as spring grass, set in a face that could have been carved from his memories. The same gentle slope of the nose, the same determined set to the jaw despite obvious exhaustion. It was like looking at Caleb through time's strange mirror. "Boy." Thomas's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "You all right, son?" The child's eyes focused with effort, as if seeing Thomas for the first time. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then, like a puppet with cut strings, he crumpled forward. Thomas lunged, catching the boy before he hit the ground. The child weighed nothing. Bird bones beneath Thomas's hands. "Easy now, easy," Thomas murmured, gathering the boy against his chest. The child's skin burned with fever through the thin cotton shirt. How long had he been standing there? How far had he walked? Thomas carried him to the house, his mind racing. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady. Inside. He laid the child on the sofa, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 3 years. In the better light, the resemblance was even more striking. If Thomas didn't know better, if he hadn't laid his own son in the ground with his own hands. He shook off the thought and focused on what needed doing. Water first. The boy's lips were cracked, his skin dry as paper. Thomas fetched a cup and lifted the child's head gently, trickling water past the parched lips. The boy swallowed reflexively. A good sign. "That's it," Thomas encouraged. "Just a little at a time." The boy's eyelids fluttered. Those green eyes. Lord help him. Those familiar eyes opened and fixed on Thomas's face. Fear flickered across the child's features, and he tried to pull away. No, it's all right," Thomas said, setting down the cup. "You're safe. This is my ranch. I found you at the fence. You're safe now." The boy's gaze darted around the room, taking in the surroundings with the wariness of a wild animal. When he tried to sit up, Thomas gently pressed him back. "Rest first. You're burning up with fever. When's the last time you ate?" The boy's mouth worked silently for a moment before he managed to whisper, 3 days, maybe 4. Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd seen hunger before, but never on a face so young, so achingly familiar. He moved to the kitchen, ladling some broth from the pot he'd made yesterday, a rare bit of proper cooking that now seemed providential. He heated it on the stove, added a bit of salt, tested the temperature. When he returned, the boy had managed to prop himself up slightly, those watchful eyes tracking Thomas's every movement. "Soup," Thomas said simply, sitting on the edge of the sofa. "Go slow." The boy reached for the bowl with shaking hands. Thomas helped steady it, watching as the child took careful sips. Color began returning to the pale cheeks, life seeping back into the small frame. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, conflict clear in his expression. Finally, "Jude." "Jude," Thomas repeated. "That's a good name. Biblical. I'm Thomas Avery. This is my ranch." Jude nodded, concentrating on the soup. When the bowl was half empty, Thomas took it away despite the boy's protest. "Too much too fast will make you sick. Rest a bit, then you can have more." Thomas studied the child in the lamplight. The resemblance to Caleb was uncanny, but there were differences too. This boy was thinner, his face marked by hardship Caleb had never known. There was a wariness in his movements, a tension that spoke of difficult times. "Where are your folks? Jude?" The boy's face closed off. "Dead. Ma died last winter. Pa, before that. I'm sorry." Thomas knew the weight of those words. How little they helped, but how necessary they were. "You got any other kin?" Jude's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, sir. No one." It was a lie. Thomas had raised a boy. He knew the tells, but he also knew when not to push. The child was scared, exhausted, sick. Truth could wait. "Well, you're welcome here until you're feeling better." Thomas said, "There's a bed in the spare room, clean clothes that might fit. They were my boys." Something flickered in Jude's eyes at that. "Your boy?" He passed 3 years back. The words still scraped his throat raw. "He was about your age, maybe a hair older." Silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Two souls marked by loss, finding each other in the vast Wyoming emptiness. Thomas fetched blankets from the chest, the wool ones Sarah had made during the long winter evenings. He tucked them around Jude, who was already fighting sleep. "Rest." Thomas said, "Everything else can wait." As the boy's eyes closed, Thomas allowed himself to really look in sleep. The wariness faded, leaving just a child who'd seen too much too young. The fever had broken into a light sweat, beating on the familiar forehead. Thomas found himself reaching out, almost touching the sandy hair, before catching himself. This wasn't Caleb. Couldn't be Caleb. But Lord help him. It was like being given a second chance at something he'd thought lost forever. He sat in his chair, watching the rise and fall of the small chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty. The boy's presence seemed to push back the shadows, fill the silence with the simple sound of breathing. Thomas found himself praying, words he hadn't spoken since the day they'd lowered Caleb into the ground, not for resurrection. He wasn't a fool, but for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to help this child who'd appeared at his fence like something out of a dream. As afternoon wore on, Jude stirred occasionally, mumbling words Thomas couldn't catch. Once, the boy cried out, arms flailing against invisible threats. Thomas was there in an instant, soothing with gentle words until the child settled again. He made more soup, cut bread into small pieces, prepared for when Jude woke. The simple acts of caretaking awakened something in him he'd thought dead. Purpose. The ranch work had kept his body moving. But this was different. This mattered. When Jude finally woke properly, the sun was setting, painting the room in gold and shadow. The boy blinked, momentarily confused, then remembered where he was. The wariness returned, but tempered now with something else. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. "Hungry?" Thomas asked. Jude nodded. This time he managed the bowl himself, eating with careful deliberation. When he finished, he looked up at Thomas with those impossible green eyes. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question. Thomas considered his words carefully. "Because you needed help. Because it's the right thing to do." He paused. "Because you remind me of someone I loved very much." Jude absorbed this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. Perhaps in his young world, love and loss and unexpected kindness were all part of the same fabric. "I can work," the boy said suddenly. "To pay for the food and bed. I'm good with horses, can mend fence. I'm not looking for charity." Pride, even half-starved and fever-weak. The boy had pride. Thomas recognized it, respected it. "We'll see about that when you're stronger. For now, your job is to rest and heal." As night fell, Thomas showed Jude to Caleb's room. He'd opened the door for the first time in years that afternoon, airing out the mustiness, making the bed with fresh linens. The boy stood in the doorway, taking in the carved wooden horse on the dresser, the books on the shelf, the small things that made it a boy's room. This was his? Yes. Jude stepped inside carefully. as if entering a church. What was his name? Caleb. Caleb James Avery. "It's a good room," Jude said softly. He was lucky. Thomas's throat tightened. We all were. He left the boy to settle in, closing the door gently. In the kitchen, he found himself making plans. Tomorrow he'd ride to town, get proper medicine for the lingering fever, clothes that fit, hearty food to put meat on those thin bones. For the first time in 3 years, tomorrow seemed like something more than just another day to endure. That night, Thomas built a fire in the fireplace, watching the flames dance and throw shadows on the walls. The house felt different with a child in it again. Fuller, warmer, more like the home it used to be. He didn't know where Jude had come from or what had driven him to walk until he collapsed at a stranger's fence. But sometimes, Thomas thought, you didn't need to understand God's plans. Sometimes you just had to accept the gifts he sent, even when they came wrapped in mystery and bearing faces that broke your heart with memory. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Jude's fever broke completely after 3 days, leaving him weak but clear-eyed. Thomas watched the boy slowly come back to life, eating with increasing appetite, color returning to his cheeks. But there were things that didn't fit the picture of a simple orphaned child. It started with small observations. The way Jude flinched when Thomas moved too quickly. How he always positioned himself where he could see the door. The careful way he ate, hunched protectively over his plate as if someone might snatch it away. These were habits born of hard experience, and Thomas knew better than to push for explanations. On the 5th morning, Thomas found Jude attempting to wash his shirt in the kitchen basin. The boy had his back turned, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing with fierce determination at stains that looked permanent. "Let me help with that," Thomas offered, stepping forward. Jude spun around, startled, and the wet shirt slipped from his hands. As he bent to retrieve it, his own shirt rode up, and Thomas glimpsed what made his blood run cold. Scars, thin white lines crisscrossing the boy's lower back, some old and faded, others pink and more recent. The unmistakable marks of a strap or switch applied with cruel regularity. Jude yanked his shirt down quickly, face flushing. Their eyes met for a moment, Thomas's filled with shocked understanding. Jude's defiant and ashamed in equal measure. "I fell," the boy said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Fell into some brambles. Barbed wire, too." Thomas nodded slowly, choosing his words with care. "Barbed wire can be cruel, especially when it happens over and over." Jude's chin lifted slightly, a spark of something, relief, fear, flashing in his green eyes. "Yes, sir, it can." They stood there in the morning kitchen, sunlight streaming through dusty windows, the weight of unspoken truth between them. Thomas wanted to rage, to demand names, to saddle Buttercup and ride off to deliver justice to whoever had marked a child this way, but he'd learned patience in his years of ranching, knew that trust, like a spooked horse, couldn't be forced. "Well," Thomas said finally, "we've got plenty of clean shirts here. No need to wash yourself raw trying to save one." He fetched one of Caleb's shirts from the drawer, soft blue cotton that Sarah had sewn with careful stitches. Jude took it with visible relief, disappearing to change. When he returned, the familiar shirt on an unfamiliar frame made Thomas's heart twist, but he kept his expression neutral. They worked together that morning, mending a section of fence near the barn. Jude proved true to his word. He was good with his hands, patient with the wire, steady despite his recent illness. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, broken only by the ping of hammers and the whistle of wind through grass. It was when they paused for water that Thomas noticed Jude's reaction to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The boy went rigid, face draining of color, eyes scanning for cover. Even when old Pete Morrison appeared over the rise, clearly just passing through on his way to town. Jude remained tense until the rider was well past. "Pete's harmless," Thomas said mildly. "Been ranching that spread to the east for longer than I've been alive." "Yes, sir." Jude's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he raised the water dipper. Just wasn't expecting company. That night, after supper, they sat by the fire. Thomas had been reading from the Bible, a habit he'd returned to with Jude in the house, when a log shifted suddenly in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks with a sharp crack. Jude was on his feet instantly, backed against the wall, arms raised defensively over his head. The naked terror on his face told a story clearer than any words could. "It's all right," Thomas said softly, not moving from his chair. "Just the fire, just a log shifting. You're safe, Jude. You're safe here." Slowly, the boy lowered his arms, embarrassment replacing fear. "I'm sorry. Sometimes No need to apologize." Thomas kept his voice gentle, steady. "We all carry things with us. Some folks' loads are heavier than others." Jude sank back into his chair, drawing his knees up to his chest. In the firelight, he looked even younger than his years, a child who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. "My uncle," he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him. "After Ma died, I went to live with my uncle." Thomas waited, letting the silence invite more without demanding it. "He has a temper." Jude's voice was barely above a whisper. "Especially when he drinks. And he drinks most nights." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas thought of all the responses he could give: anger, sympathy, promises of protection. But what came out was simply, "You don't have to go back." Jude's head snapped up, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "He's my kin. The law says..." "The law says a lot of things. Doesn't make them right." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "You're welcome here as long as you want to stay. That's all that matters right now. But if he comes looking, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Thomas's voice carried a quiet certainty. "I've buried a wife and child. Jude, there's not much left that frightens me. Certainly not a man who'd raise his hand to a boy." Jude studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Some of the tension eased from his thin shoulders, though Thomas could see he didn't fully believe in his safety yet. That would take time. Over the following days, more pieces of Jude's story emerged in fragments. His father had died in a mining accident when Jude was 6. His mother had taken in washing, worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep them fed, when consumption finally claimed her. Jude's uncle, his father's brother, had grudgingly taken him in. "He said I ate too much," Jude confided one afternoon as they repaired leather tack in the barn. "Said I was another mouth he couldn't afford, but he kept me anyway because I could work, 6 days a week at his store, and Sundays on his little farm. And when you didn't work fast enough?" Thomas kept his tone neutral, focusing on the bridle in his hands. "The strap." Jude's voice was matter-of-fact. "Or his fists, if he was deep in the bottle. I learned to be fast, but sometimes..." He shrugged. "Sometimes there was no pleasing him." Thomas's hand stilled on the leather. "How long since you ran?" 2 weeks. Maybe. Hard to keep track on the road." Jude looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes. "I didn't mean to run. Not at first. But one night he came at me with a poker from the fire, and I couldn't anymore. Just couldn't. You did right," Thomas said firmly. "Takes courage to save yourself when no one else will. He'll come looking. It wasn't a question. He doesn't like losing things he thinks he owns. Let him come." Thomas resumed his work, voice calm. "Man wants to discuss the matter. He can discuss it with me. And Sheriff Watson, if it comes to that. Jim Watson's a fair man. He's got no patience for those who hurt children." That night, Thomas lay awake thinking. He'd taken the boy in out of basic human decency and a resemblance that had stopped his heart. But now, knowing what Jude had endured, the stakes felt different. This wasn't just about giving shelter to a lost child. This was about standing between that child and the cruelty that had driven him to collapse at a stranger's fence. He thought of Caleb, safe and loved all his short life, never knowing the fear that lived in Jude's eyes. What would Sarah have done? But he knew the answer. Sarah would have fought like a wildcat to protect any child, let alone one who looked so much like their lost boy. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. He rode to town, leaving Jude safe at the ranch with strict instructions to stay inside if anyone came by. In town, he stopped first at the sheriff's office. Jim Watson listened to the story with growing anger, his weathered face darkening when Thomas described the scars. "You know the uncle's name?" Jude hasn't said, still scared. "I think. Well, when he's ready to talk, you bring him by. Meanwhile, that boy's under your protection as far as I'm concerned. Anyone comes around making trouble, you send them to me." Thomas's next stop was the general store for supplies. He bought sturdy clothes in Jude's size, boots that would actually fit, a warm coat for the coming winter. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Hartley, added peppermint sticks to the order with a knowing smile. "Heard you had a young visitor out your way," she said. "Good to see you looking after someone again. Thomas." He returned to find Jude exactly where he'd left him, curled in the chair with one of Caleb's old adventure books. The relief on the boy's face when Thomas walked through the door told its own story. "Thought you might have changed your mind," Jude admitted quietly. "Not a chance." Thomas set down the packages. "Got you some things. Clothes that fit proper. Boots, too. Can't have you work in the ranch in those worn-through things." Jude fingered the new clothes with wonder, running his hands over the sturdy fabric. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'll work hard to earn them. I promise. You've earned them already," Thomas said gruffly. "Just by surviving what you've survived. Now try them on. We've got fence to mend this afternoon, and I need my ranch hand properly outfitted." As Jude disappeared to change, Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He couldn't bring Caleb back, couldn't undo what had been done to this boy, but he could stand between Jude and further harm. He could offer safety, stability, the chance to be a child again. It wasn't enough to heal all wounds, but it was a start. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. Thomas found fresh boot prints around the chicken coop, deep heel marks that didn't match his own worn boots or Jude's smaller prints. Someone had been walking the perimeter of the property during the night, studying the layout. The discovery sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the October wind. He didn't mention it to Jude immediately. The boy had finally begun to relax, sleeping through the night without crying out, eating without constantly checking over his shoulder. Thomas didn't want to shatter that fragile peace, but he started wearing his Colt revolver again, something he hadn't done since the early days after Sarah's death when grief made him reckless. The second sign came 3 days later. Thomas was returning from the barn when he spotted a figure on the ridge overlooking the ranch, just standing there, bold as brass, watching, even at a distance. Thomas could make out the dark coat and hat, the way the man stood with his weight on one hip, arrogant, proprietary. When Thomas raised his hand to shield his eyes for a better look, the figure turned and disappeared beyond the rise. That night, he found Jude on the porch despite the cold, staring out into the darkness. "You've seen him too," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Jude nodded, arms wrapped tight around his knees. "Yesterday, and the day before." "He's watching, waiting. Your uncle?" "His name's Elias Thornton." The words came out bitter. "Owns a dry goods store in Willow Creek, about 40 miles south. My pa's older brother. Ma never liked him, said he had a mean streak wider than the Platte River." She was right. Thomas settled beside the boy on the step. "What's he waiting for, you think? For you to leave, or for me to be alone?" Jude's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the tremor in his hands. He's not one for direct confrontation if he can avoid it, prefers to catch people when they're vulnerable. "Well, he'll be waiting a long time then. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you unless you want to. He won't give up," Jude said quietly. "He thinks I stole from him when I left. Took food, a blanket, couple dollars from the cash box. In his mind, that makes me a thief, makes me his property until I pay it back, and he'll make sure I never can." The third sign was more direct. Thomas woke before dawn to find a piece of paper wedged under the front door. The message was written in a cramped, angry hand. "The boy belongs with his family. I'll be coming for what's mine. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. E. Thornton." Thomas crumpled the paper in his fist. The implied threat, the assumption that Jude was property to be reclaimed, it made his blood boil. He'd seen this kind of man before, the type who confused fear with respect, who thought strength meant crushing those weaker than himself. He showed the note to Jude over breakfast. The boy read it once, then pushed his eggs around his plate. Appetite gone. "I should go," Jude said finally. "Before there's trouble, you've been kind to me. Mr. Avery, I don't want to bring danger to your door." "The only danger at my door is already there," Thomas replied firmly. "And running won't solve anything. He'll just follow you. And next time, you might not find a fence to collapse at." "But if someone gets hurt because of me, the only person responsible for Elias Thornton's actions is Elias Thornton." Thomas leaned forward. "You're not bringing trouble here. Son, you're a boy who needs protection, and I'm able to provide it. That's the end of it." That afternoon, while Jude was in the barn tending to Buttercup, Thomas saw movement near the southern fence. This time, there were 3 figures: Thornton and 2 others, rough-looking men who had the bearing of hired muscle. They stayed just beyond the property line, but their intent was clear: intimidation. Thomas checked his rifle, made sure his revolver was loaded. He'd fought in the war between the states as a young man, had defended this ranch from claim jumpers in the early days. He knew how to handle men who thought might made right, but he also knew the value of preparation. The confrontation came at dusk. Thomas was closing up the chicken coop when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders came up the path bold as brass. Thornton flanked by his 2 companions. Thomas recognized the type, men who do dirty work for drinking money. Elias Thornton was a big man, broad through the shoulders with hands like ham hocks. His face might have been handsome once, but years of drink and meanness had left it bloated and cruel. His eyes were the same green as Jude's, but where the boys held warmth, Thornton's were cold as winter stone. "Evening," Thornton said, not bothering to dismount. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Evening," Thomas replied evenly. "Can't say as I do. Everything on this ranch is mine, bought and paid for. The boy, my nephew." Thornton's voice carried an edge of impatience. "I've come to take him home where he belongs. Jude's welcome to leave any time he chooses. Door's not barred." Thomas kept his hand casual, but near his holster. "Course, he seems to prefer it here. So, can't imagine why a boy would run from his loving uncle in the dead of night." Thornton's face darkened. "That boy's a thief and a runaway. The law says he belongs with his kin. The law also has opinions about men who beat children." Thomas let that hang in the air. "Sheriff Watson and I had an interesting talk about that just the other day." One of Thornton's companions shifted nervously in his saddle. Apparently, they hadn't signed on for anything involving the sheriff. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "Rancher," Thornton said, leaning forward. "That boy's wild. Needs a firm hand. Spare the rod and all that. The good book's clear on the matter. The good book also speaks of mercy." Thomas replied, "And about not provoking children to wrath, seems to me you might have skipped those passages." The door opened behind him, and Thomas heard Jude's sharp intake of breath. He didn't turn, keeping his eyes on the 3 men. "Get back inside, Jude," he said calmly. "Well, well." Thornton's smile was ugly. "There's my nephew. Come here, boy. Time to go home. I'm not going anywhere with you." Jude's voice shook but held firm. "This is my home now." "Your home?" Thornton laughed. An unpleasant sound. "You don't have a home, boy. You've got a debt to pay. Food you ate, roof over your head, clothes on your back. None of that came free. You owe me 3 years' labor, and I mean to collect. Whatever debt you imagine the boy owes, I'll pay it." Thomas pulled out his wallet. "How much to clear his account?" Thornton's eyes glittered with greed, but he shook his head. It's not about money. It's about teaching the boy responsibility, about family obligations. It's about control, Thomas said flatly. And it ends here. The boy stays. You leave. That's the only way this goes. The moment stretched taut. One of Thornton's men rested his hand on his gun butt. Thomas shifted slightly. Ready. This isn't over, Thornton said finally. That boy's my blood. No piece of paper is going to change that. And no broken-down rancher playing at being a father is going to keep me from what's mine. I said leave. Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse than 3 bullies. Now, before I forget my manners entirely. Thornton jerked his horse's head around roughly, spurring the animal harder than necessary. His companions followed, clearly relieved to be going. At the gate, Thornton turned back. You can't watch him every minute, Avery, and you can't protect him forever, one way or another. I'll get what's owed me. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving silence in their wake. Thomas stood still until the hoofbeats faded, then turned to find Jude white-faced in the doorway. He means it, the boy whispered. He'll come back. He'll find the same answer he got today. Thomas climbed the steps, placed a steady hand on Jude's shoulder. Men like that are cowards at heart. They prey on the defenseless, but stand up to them, and they back down. Not Uncle Elias, he holds grudges. He'll wait until... Then we'll be ready. Thomas guided the boy inside, barring the door behind them. First thing tomorrow, we're riding to town. Going to have a proper talk with Sheriff Watson. Get some papers drawn up. Make it legal. You staying here. You mean adoption? Jude's eyes widened. Thomas hadn't put the word to it before, but hearing it aloud felt right. If you're willing, can't replace your ma in PA, wouldn't try. But I can give you a home. Protection under the law. Make it so Thornton has no claim. But I'm nobody, just a runaway who... You're not nobody. Thomas's voice was firm. You're a brave boy who saved himself from a bad situation. You're a hard worker who's earned his place here. And if you're willing, you'll be my son in the eyes of the law. Thornton won't be able to touch you. Jude's eyes filled with tears he'd been too proud to shed before. You'd do that, even knowing he won't give up easy? Especially knowing that. Thomas pulled the boy into a rough embrace, feeling the thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. I lost my son. Jude, thought I'd lost everything worth living for. Then you showed up at my fence. Looking so much like him, it stopped my heart. Maybe that was God's way of telling me I had more to give. More fight left in me than I knew. They stood there in the lamplight. A man who'd lost everything and a boy who'd never had anything, finding in each other what they'd both needed, outside. Darkness gathered thick around the ranch, and somewhere in that darkness, Elias Thornton nursed his wounded pride and plotted his return. But inside the house, for this moment, there was warmth and safety, and the promise of belonging. Thomas knew the fight wasn't over. Men like Thornton didn't give up easily, especially when their pride was wounded. There would be more visits, more threats, possibly worse. But looking at Jude, his son now, in heart if not yet in law, Thomas felt ready for whatever came next. He'd spent 3 years among the dead. Now he had something to fight for among the living. The week that followed passed in uneasy quiet. Thomas and Jude went about their daily routines, mending fence, tending stock, preparing for winter, but always with one eye on the horizon. They'd ridden to town as planned, where Judge Harrison had drawn up preliminary adoption papers and Sheriff Watson had taken Jude's statement about the abuse. The legal wheels were turning, but slowly, these things take time, Watson had said. But don't worry. Any man comes to your property making threats, you send word, I'll handle it personal. The respite ended on a cold Sunday evening. Thomas was reading by the fire while Jude worked on his letters at the kitchen table. The boy was eager to improve his education, having had little formal schooling. The knock at the door was measured, almost polite. Thomas exchanged glances with Jude, then rose, checking his revolver. Who's there? Thomas Avery? My name's Jacob Morse. I'm here with Elias Thornton. We'd like a word. Peaceful-like. Thomas recognized the name. Morse was a lawyer from Willow Creek, known for taking questionable cases if the money was right. He opened the door cautiously, keeping his hand near his weapon. 3 men stood on his porch. Thornton, trying to look respectable in a clean suit. Morse, thin and sharp-featured as a ferret, carrying a leather portfolio. The 3rd man Thomas didn't recognize, but his bearing suggested hired muscle despite his attempt at Sunday clothes. Mr. Avery, Morse began smoothly. I'm here representing Mr. Thornton in the matter of his nephew's custody. Might we come in, discuss this like civilized men? We can talk just fine from here. Thomas replied, blocking the doorway. State your business. Morse's smile never wavered. Very well, mister. Thornton is the boy's legal guardian, his closest living relative. While he regrets that young Jude ran away following a misunderstanding, he's willing to forgive the transgression. He simply wants his nephew returned to his care. Misunderstanding? Thomas kept his voice level. That what you call beating a child with a strap until his back's nothing but scars? Discipline, Thornton interjected, his facade of civility slipping. The boy was willful, disobedient. Sometimes correction is necessary. Furthermore, Morse continued, shooting Thornton a warning glance, there's the matter of theft. The boy took money and goods when he left. Mr. Thornton would be within his rights to press charges, but he's willing to overlook this if Jude returns voluntarily. From behind, Thomas came Jude's voice, steady despite the fear Thomas knew he must be feeling. I took $3 in a blanket, payment for 3 years of unpaid labor, less than I was owed. You see, Thornton's face flushed, still defiant, still ungrateful for everything I did for him. What you did for him? Thomas let his anger show now. You worked him like a slave, beat him for sport, and call it charity? Get off my land. Now! Morse raised a placating hand. Let's not let emotions override the law. Mr. Avery, I understand you've begun adoption proceedings. Noble, certainly, but unlikely to succeed. Courts favor blood relatives in these matters. Save yourself the trouble and expense. Return the boy, and this all goes away. The only thing going away is you. Now. Morse sighed theatrically. I'd hoped to resolve this amicably, but if you insist on this course... He pulled out a document. This is a formal demand for the return of Jude Thornton to his legal guardian. You have 1 week to comply. After that, Mr. Thornton will pursue all legal remedies, including charges of kidnapping and harboring a runaway. Thomas took the paper without looking at it. Jude stays here. You want to make a fight of it in court. We'll fight, but that boy doesn't leave this ranch with you. Not today, not ever. The 3rd man, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward slightly. Mighty sure of yourself. Rancher. But the law's the law, and accidents happen on these isolated spreads. Fires start. Cattle wander off. Be a shame if... Thomas's Colt was in his hand before the man finished his threat. Not pointed, but visible. Finish that thought, please. The man stepped back, hands raising slightly. Morse's composed expression finally cracked. There's no need for weapons. Mr. Avery, we're leaving. He turned to Thornton. Come, we've delivered our message. Thornton's eyes burned with fury, but he followed the lawyer. At the porch steps, he turned back. 1 week, boy, then I'm coming for you, legal or not, and Avery here won't always be around to protect you. They mounted their horses and rode off. Morse already lecturing Thornton about keeping his temper. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the darkness, then closed and barred the door. Jude sat at the table, the paper with his letters crumpled where he'd gripped it. I'm sorry, he whispered. I've brought nothing but trouble. You've brought life back to this place, Thomas corrected, sitting beside him. First time in 3 years I've had something worth fighting for. That's not trouble. Son, that's purpose. But what if the judge sides with him? Blood relation and all. Then we'll find another way. I've got some money saved. We could go somewhere else. Start fresh. California, maybe, or Oregon. Lots of land out there for a man and his son to build something new. Jude looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. You'd leave your ranch? Your wife and boy are buried here. Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking of the small cemetery on the hill. Sarah and Caleb aren't in that ground. They're in my heart. They go where I go, and I think they'd want me to protect you, to choose life over graves. The next days passed intense preparation. Thomas reinforced the shutters, moved his rifle to strategic locations around the house, and made sure the well was clear in case of fire. He sent word to Sheriff Watson about the threats, and the sheriff promised to ride out regularly. On the fourth night, Thomas woke to Buttercup's nervous whinnying. He rose silently, peering through the window. Shadows moved near the chicken coop. 2 figures, maybe 3, trying to stay quiet. He woke Jude with a hand over his mouth, finger to his lips. The boy's eyes went wide, but he nodded understanding. Thomas handed him the shotgun they'd practiced with. Stay here, he whispered. Anyone tries to come through that door who isn't me, you fire. Don't think, just fire. Thomas slipped out the back door, moving with the stealth his war years had taught him. The half-moon provided just enough light to navigate. He circled wide, coming up behind the intruders. 3 men, none of them Thornton. Hired hands, carrying torches not yet lit. They were arguing in whispers about whether to fire the barn or the house first. Thomas stepped out of the shadows, rifle leveled. Evening, gentlemen. Bit late for a social call. They spun, one reaching for his gun. Thomas's shot took his hat off, the sound splitting the night. Next one goes lower, Thomas said conversationally. Now drop the torches. And your guns. Slow and easy. They complied, fear replacing bravado. These weren't hardened criminals, just men who'd taken Thornton's money for what they'd thought would be easy work. Names, Thomas demanded. They gave them reluctantly, ranch hands from Willow Creek. All 3, men with families, by their own admission, just trying to make extra money. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas said. You're going to walk back to wherever you left your horses. You're going to ride home, and you're going to forget Elias Thornton exists, because if I see any of you near my property again, I won't be aiming for your hat. Clear? They nodded vigorously, backing away, then turning to run when Thomas gestured with his rifle. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before gathering up their dropped weapons and the unlit torches. Jude met him at the door, shotgun still clutched in white-knuckled hands. Are they gone? For now. Thomas secured the weapons, then put his hand on Jude's shoulder. You did good. Staying put. Took courage. I was scared. Jude admitted. Being scared's not the same as being a coward. Coward would have run. You stood ready to defend our home. Thomas smiled grimly. That makes you braver than those 3 put together. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Not Thornton or his men, but old Pete Morrison, leading a horse with a rider slumped in the saddle. The rider was one of the men from 2 nights before. Thornton's muscle who'd made the veiled threats. Now he was barely conscious, face bloody and swollen. Found him on the road near my place, Pete said, spitting tobacco juice. Says he's got something to tell you. Wouldn't let me take him to town until he talked to you. Thomas helped the man down, half carrying him to the porch. Jude brought water, holding the cup to split lips. Name's Rafe Cooper. The man gasped out. Was working for Thornton, but I'm done. Man's lost his mind. What happened to you? Told him I wouldn't be part of burning folks out, not with a kid involved. He didn't take it well. Rafe tried to smile, winced instead. Beat me worse than he ever beat the boy. His other man, Silas, held me while Thornton worked me over. Why tell me? Rafe's good eye fixed on Jude. Because I got a boy about your age. Because what Thornton's planning. He coughed, specks of blood on his lips. He's not waiting for the week to be up. Tomorrow night. Him and 5 others he's bringing from Laramie. Plans to burn you out. Take the boy in the confusion. Maybe put a bullet in you if you resist. Thomas felt cold despite the morning sun. You sure? Heard him planning it. That's when I tried to back out. Rafe gripped Thomas's arm. Get the boy away. Tonight. Thornton's pride is hurt now. He won't stop until someone's dead. Pete spoke up. I'll ride for the sheriff, but even pushing hard, don't know if he can get here in time. Thomas made a decision. Take Mr. Cooper with you. He needs a doctor. And Pete, stop by the Bancroft place. The Millers. Anyone else you trust. Tell them what's happening. Tell them, he paused, then set his jaw. Tell them Thomas Avery's calling in his markers. Every favor owed, every kindness remembered. Time to stand together. Pete nodded, understanding. I'll spread the word. You've helped enough folks over the years. Thomas, time they returned it. As Pete helped Rafe back onto the horse, the injured man caught Jude's hand. I'm sorry, boy, for my part in this, for not speaking up sooner. Jude squeezed his hand gently. Thank you for speaking up now. After they left, Thomas and Jude stood together on the porch, looking out at the ranch that had become their battleground. We staying to fight? Jude asked quietly. Thomas thought of running, of starting over somewhere safe. Then he looked at the boy beside him, thin but growing stronger, scared but standing tall, and knew there was only one answer. We're staying, he said. This is our home, and sometimes, son, you have to stand and fight for your home, for your family, for what's right. Jude nodded, no longer the terrified child who'd collapsed at the fence. Then we'd better get ready. As the sun climbed higher, they began their preparations, not knowing if help would come in time, but determined to face whatever darkness approached together, father and son in all but blood, soon to be tested by fire. The day passed in grim preparation. Thomas and Jude worked with focused urgency, turning the ranch house into a fortress. They filled every available container with water, soaking blankets and placing them strategically in case of fire. Thomas taught Jude how to reload quickly, where to position himself for the best coverage, how to stay low and move between windows. Remember, Thomas said as they barricaded the windows, leaving slots for shooting. They're expecting to catch us sleeping. Element of surprise works both ways. Jude nodded, helping to push the heavy kitchen table against the door. Despite the danger, there was something different about him. A straightness to his spine, a steadiness in his hands. The boy who'd flinched at shadows was becoming someone stronger. As afternoon waned, they watched the horizon anxiously. Would Pete Morrison spread the word in time? Would anyone come? Thomas had helped his neighbors over the years, pulled Cal Bancroft's wagon from a mud hole, helped the Millers rebuild after a storm, doctored Sam Chen's horse when no one else would serve a Chinese rancher. But asking them to risk their lives was different. What if no one comes? Jude asked quietly as they ate a cold supper, not wanting smoke from the chimney to signal their readiness. Then we hold out as long as we can, make it cost them dear. Thomas checked his ammunition again. But I have faith in folks. Most people are decent when it counts. As darkness fell, they took their positions. Thomas at the front windows, Jude covering the back. They dragged mattresses down to create barriers, turned furniture into shields. The house Sarah had made into a home was now a battlefield. The waiting was the hardest part. Every sound might be the beginning. Every shadow could hide an enemy. The moon was new, leaving only starlight to see by. Thomas found himself thinking of another night like this, during the war, waiting for Confederate raiders. He'd been young then, fighting for cause and country. Now he was older, fighting for something more personal, the boy who'd given him reason to live again. It was past midnight when they heard the horses, multiple riders, moving without urgency, confident in their numbers. Thomas counted hoofbeats, 6, maybe 7. His hands were steady on his rifle. They're here, he called softly to Jude. Remember what we practiced. The riders stopped just beyond the yard. Thomas could make out Thornton's bulky form, hear his voice giving orders. They were spreading out, planning to surround the house. One man was already moving toward the barn with what looked like a torch. Thomas sighted carefully and fired. The man spun and dropped. torch falling harmlessly into the dirt. The night exploded into chaos. "Avery!" Thornton's voice roared. "You just signed your death warrant!" More shots came from the attackers, slamming into the reinforced walls. Thomas fired back methodically, making each shot count. Behind him, he heard Jude's shotgun boom, followed by cursing from the back of the house. "Good shot!" Thomas called, pride mixing with fear. The firefight intensified, windows shattered, letting in cold night air and the smell of gunpowder. One attacker tried to rush the porch. Thomas dropped him at the steps. Another threw a lit torch at the roof, but it rolled off, the wet blankets they'd placed doing their job. Then, just when Thomas was starting to worry about ammunition, new gunfire erupted, but not aimed at the house. Riders were pouring in from the north road, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness. "It's Pete," someone shouted. "Pete Morrison and half the valley." Thomas's heart soared as he recognized voices. Cal Bancroft's booming laugh as he traded shots with the attackers. Sam Chen's precise rifle work. Even old Widow Miller's distinctive carbine. His neighbors had come. The tide turned quickly, outnumbered now and caught in crossfire. Thornton's men began to scatter. Two threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Another tried to flee and was ridden down by the Bancroft boys. "Thornton!" Sheriff Watson's voice cut through the noise. He'd made it after all. "This is the law. Stand down or be shot down." For a moment, it seemed Thornton might surrender. Then, with a roar of rage, he charged the house, pistol in one hand, a flaming brand in the other. He was focused on the front door. Hadn't seen Jude slip around to the side window. The boy's shotgun blast took Thornton in the shoulder, spinning him around. The torch flew from his hand, landing in the water-soaked dirt. Thornton stumbled, tried to raise his pistol, and Thomas shot him in the leg. The big man went down hard, screaming curses. "Don't kill him," Jude said quietly, appearing at Thomas's shoulder. "He's not worth hanging for." Thomas lowered his rifle, looking at the boy with new respect. After everything Thornton had done, Jude still chose mercy. That took a different kind of courage. The cleanup was swift. Sheriff Watson arrested Thornton and his surviving men, promising they'd see serious prison time for attempted murder and arson. Doc Hartley tended the wounded, mostly Thornton's hired guns, though Cal Bancroft had taken a graze to the arm he'd brag about for years. As dawn broke, the yard was full of neighbors. Women arrived with food and coffee. Men helped repair the damage. The ranch that had been so empty for so long was alive with community. "Never seen anything like it," Pete Morrison said, clapping Thomas on the back. "Whole valley turning out like this. But then, you've always been there when folks needed you. About time we returned the favor." Sam Chen, usually reserved, shook Thomas's hand firmly. "When Pete said you were in trouble, protecting a boy from abuse, there was no question. We all came." Jude stood a little apart, overwhelmed by the support. Widow Miller enveloped him in a grandmotherly hug that left him breathless but smiling. "You're a brave young man," she declared. "Standing up to that monster, Thomas is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one, ma'am," Jude replied, his eyes finding Thomas across the yard. Sheriff Watson approached, notebook in hand. "Judge Harrison's here too, rode in with me. Given the circumstances, he's willing to finalize the adoption papers today, unless there's any objection." "No objection," Thomas said quickly. "But is it legal? With Thornton still—" "Thornton's going away for a long time," Watson interrupted. "Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, child abuse. He won't be bothering anyone again. As for the adoption, Judge says given the exceptional circumstances and the clear evidence of the boy's previous situation, he's prepared to expedite matters." An hour later, in the crowded main room of the ranch house, Judge Harrison performed the simple ceremony that made Jude legally Thomas's son. The boy signed his new name with a shaking hand. "Jude Thomas Avery. Has a nice ring to it," Thomas said, his own voice not quite steady. As the crowd finally dispersed, leaving father and son alone, they stood on the porch watching the sun climb higher. The ranch showed scars from the night's battle, bullet holes in the walls, Scorched earth where torches had fallen. But it had survived. They had survived. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said quietly. Jude looked up, surprised. "For what?" "When I first saw you at that fence, I thought God was playing a cruel trick. You looked so much like Caleb. I thought I was seeing ghosts." Thomas put his hand on Jude's shoulder. "But you're not Caleb. You're your own person, with your own courage, your own story. And I'm proud to call you my son, not because you remind me of him, but because of who you are." Jude's eyes glistened. "I never had a real father. My PA died when I was too young to really know him. But if I could have chosen—" He swallowed hard. "I'd have chosen you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors' dust trails disappear in the distance. The ranch felt different now, still touched by memory, but no longer haunted by it. The empty spaces were filling with new life, new purpose. "So," Thomas said eventually, "we've got a ranch to run, and I've got a son to finish raising. Better teach you to read proper, get you caught up on your schooling. Ranching's hard work, but it takes brains too." "Yes, sir." Jude grinned. "Pa!" The word hung in the air between them, perfect and powerful. Thomas felt something ease in his chest, a knot he'd carried for 3 years finally loosening. He wasn't replacing Caleb any more than Jude was replacing his birth parents. They were building something new from the ashes of their losses, as they walked back into their battle-scarred but unbroken home. Thomas thought he felt Sarah's approval in the morning breeze. She'd always said the heart had room for infinite love, that loving more didn't mean loving less. He understood that now. The house that had echoed with emptiness now held laughter again. The ranch that had been slowly dying had purpose. And 2 souls who'd thought themselves alone had found family in the most unexpected way. The dawn came early and cold, painting frost across the window panes. 3 weeks had passed since the night of fire and lead, and the ranch had settled into a new rhythm. The bullet holes remained in the walls. Thomas said they'd patch them come spring, but Jude suspected his father kept them as reminders that some battles were worth fighting. They were working on the south fence line when Jude spotted the rider. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle they kept close, old habits dying hard. But Thomas, squinting against the morning sun, relaxed his shoulders. Just one rider, moving slow, not trying to hide. He studied the approaching figure. "That's Rafe Cooper." Jude tensed. The man who'd warned them about Thornton's attack had recovered from his beating, but they hadn't seen him since that night. What would bring him back now? Rafe stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat. The bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows, but he sat straighter in the saddle than before. "Mr. Avery, Jude, hope I'm not intruding." "You're welcome here, Mr. Cooper," Thomas said. "You risked a lot to warn us. That won't be forgotten." Rafe dismounted slowly, favoring his left side. "I came to make things right, as much as I can." He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a worn leather pouch. "This belongs to Jude. Money his ma left with Thornton for the boy's care. Thornton never spent a cent of it on him." Jude stared at the pouch. "Ma left money. She was dying, knew it, gave Thornton everything she'd saved, near $50, to see you were looked after proper." Rafe's jaw tightened. "He kept it all, worked you like a slave, and called it charity. Found it when I was clearing out my things from his store." Thomas took the pouch, hefting it thoughtfully before handing it to Jude. "Your mother's final gift. Spend it wisely." "There's more," Rafe continued, looking uncomfortable. "Thornton's headed to prison. No question. His store, his property. It's all being sold to pay his debts and fines. But seems he put the deed to his farmland in your name. Jude did it years ago for tax reasons. Never bothered changing it after your ma died." "I don't want it," Jude said quickly. "Nothing of his? Understandable. But consider, it's 40 acres of decent land. You could sell it, use the money for your education. Or keep it, lease it out. Either way, it's yours by right. Small compensation for what you endured." Thomas placed a hand on Jude's shoulder. You don't need to decide now. Think on it. Rafe nodded, preparing to leave, then paused. One more thing. I'm heading west. Colorado, maybe California. Can't stay in Willow Creek after going against Thornton. But I wanted you to know, Jude, seeing you stand up to him, seeing Mr. Avery here willing to fight for you, it changed something in me. Made me remember there's still good in the world worth standing for. After Rafe left, Thomas and Jude returned to their work in thoughtful silence. The fence posts went in steady and straight, the rhythm of shared labor its own kind of conversation. What do you think I should do? Jude asked finally. About the land? Thomas considered carefully. Land's just land. It's what you do with it that matters. That property saw bad times, but it could see good ones too. New owners, new purpose, or sold to fund your future. Either way, you're taking something that was meant for ill and turning it to good. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jude practiced his letters while Thomas read from the newspaper Pete Morrison had brought. The world beyond their ranch was changing. Railroads pushing further west, territories becoming states, the frontier slowly transforming into something else. Says here they're building a new school in Laramie. Thomas mentioned, looking for students who show promise, good preparation for college back east, if a young man was so inclined. Jude looked up from his slate. College? I can barely read proper. You're learning fast, mind like yours. Hungry for knowledge? Be ashamed to waste it on just ranching. Thomas smiled. Not that ranching's bad work, but you could be more. Teacher, lawyer, doctor, whatever you set your mind to. What about the ranch? You need help here. Ranch will manage. Besides, educated man could do a lot for a place like this. Modern methods, new ideas, education's never wasted. Son? A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas answered it cautiously. Old habits, but smiled when he saw who it was. Mary Bancroft stood on the porch, her son Timothy beside her, both carrying covered dishes. Hope we're not intruding, she said, but Timothy's been pestering me to visit. Wants to meet the boy who stood up to all those men. Timothy, about Jude's age, but stockier, looked at Jude with obvious admiration. Is it true you shot Elias Thornton? My PA says you saved Mr. Avery's life. Jude flushed. I just did what I had to, nothing heroic about it. Don't let him fool you, Thomas said, inviting the Bancrofts in. Boy's got more courage than most grown men. As they shared supper, Timothy and Jude began talking, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm, books they'd read, horses they'd known, dreams they harbored. It was the first time Thomas had seen Jude interact with someone his own age, and the transformation was remarkable. The guarded wariness dropped away, revealing the bright, curious boy underneath. Timothy's been studying with Reverend Morrison, Mary said, watching the boys. He rides over twice a week. I'm sure he'd welcome another student if Jude's interested. Can I? Jude asked Thomas eagerly. Don't see why not. Education's important, and seems you've found a friend in the bargain. After the Bancrofts left, with promises that Timothy would come by later in the week, Jude helped clear the dishes with unusual energy. I never had a friend before, he admitted. Not a real one. Uncle Elias didn't like me mixing with other children, said they'd put ideas in my head. Well, ideas are exactly what you need. Friends, too. Can't go through life alone. You did, for 3 years. Thomas paused in his washing. And look where it got me. Half dead inside, going through the motions. Took a boy collapsing at my fence to wake me up. Don't make my mistakes. Jude, life's meant to be shared. The next days brought a stream of visitors. Word had spread about the boy who'd helped fight off Thornton's gang. And folks were curious. Some came with gifts, preserved fruit, warm clothes for the coming winter, books for Jude's studies. Others came with offers of work, wanting to hire the boy who'd proven himself brave and steady. But the most significant visit came from Sheriff Watson, arriving on a crisp Thursday morning with papers in hand. Thought you should see this, he said, accepting coffee gratefully. Letter from the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Seems Thornton wasn't just a local bully. He's wanted in Kansas for assault, and there's suspicion he was involved in some rustling operations. You two didn't just defend yourselves. You helped bring down a genuine criminal. We just wanted to be left alone." Thomas said, "Sometimes that's the hardest fight of all." Watson turned to Jude. "There's a reward. Not much, but enough to help with your schooling, if you're minded to pursue it." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas found Jude sitting on the porch steps, his mother's money pouch in his hands. "Thinking about her?" Thomas asked, settling beside him. "Trying to remember more. It's been 4 years. Sometimes I can't picture her face clearly." Jude's voice was soft. "But I remember her hands, always working, washing, mending, cooking, always trying to make things better for me. She loved you. Everything else flows from that. Like you loved Caleb." "Yes." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Love doesn't die with the person. It finds new channels, new purposes. Your mother's love led you here. My love for Caleb made room for you. It's not replacement, it's continuation." Jude leaned against Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of trust that would have been impossible weeks ago. "I'm glad I found your fence that day." "So am I, son. So am I." As darkness gathered, they could see lights from neighboring ranches dotting the valley. No longer isolated, no longer alone. The community that had rallied to their defense continued to embrace them, weaving them into the fabric of shared lives and mutual support. "Pa," Jude said, the title coming easier now. "I've decided about the land. I want to sell it, use the money for school, but not just for me. Maybe start a fund, help other kids who need education but can't afford it. Kids who've had hard times like me." Thomas felt a surge of pride. Your mother would be proud. Taking something painful and making it serve a good purpose. That's wisdom beyond your years. I learned from you. You took your pain and made room for me. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Jude's first lesson with Reverend Morrison. Winter preparations for the ranch. The ongoing work of building a life together. But tonight, there was peace. The boy who'd arrived starving and scared had found more than food and shelter. He'd found a father, a community, a future bright with possibility. And the man who'd thought his heart buried on a hillside had discovered it still had room to grow. Inside the house, warm lamplight beckoned. Together, they rose and went in, leaving the darkness outside where it belonged. They had survived the fire and emerged stronger, forged into a family by trial and choice, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley into a canvas of green and gold. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Jude work with the new colt in the corral. The boy had grown 3 inches over the winter, his shoulders broadening, his movements confident and sure. The scared child who'd collapsed at the fence was now a young man finding his place in the world. "Easy now, easy," Jude murmured to the colt, his voice carrying the patient authority Thomas had taught him. The animal, skittish moments before, calmed under his touch. It was a gift, Thomas reflected, the way Jude could gentle even the wildest creatures, perhaps because he understood what it meant to be frightened and alone. The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Judge Harrison's carriage rolled up the path, unexpected but not unwelcome. Beside him sat a woman Thomas didn't recognize, dressed in traveling clothes, her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, Thomas, Jude," the judge called out, helping his companion down. "I brought someone who's traveled a long way to see you." The woman stepped forward, removing her hat to reveal graying hair and kind eyes that widened as they fixed on Jude. "My lord," she breathed, "you look just like your father." Jude froze, the lead rope going slack in his hands. Who are you?" "Margaret Sawyer. Was Margaret Thornton before I married?" She took a steadying breath. "I'm your father's sister. Your aunt." Thomas moved protectively closer to Jude, old instincts flaring. Another Thornton, another potential threat. But the woman held up her hands, understanding his concern. I know what you're thinking. And you've every right. My brothers. She shook her head. I left the family 20 years ago because I couldn't stomach their ways. Didn't even know my younger brother had died until last month, when I heard about Elias's arrest. Why are you here? Jude's voice was carefully neutral, but Thomas could see the tension in his shoulders. Margaret reached into her bag, pulling out a worn photograph. Because I knew your father, the real one, not the monster Elias became. James was different from the rest of us Thorntons. Gentle, like you seem to be. I hoped, something of him might have survived. She held out the photograph. After a moment's hesitation, Jude took it. Thomas looked over his shoulder at the image, a young man with Jude's eyes and jawline, standing beside a woman who could only be Jude's mother. They looked happy, hopeful, unaware of the tragedy waiting in their future. I have no claim on you, Margaret continued. No right to appear after all these years. But when I heard what Elias had done, how he'd treated you, I had to come, to apologize, if nothing else, to tell you that not all your blood relations are cut from his cloth. Where were you? Jude asked quietly. When Ma died? When I had nowhere to go but to him? Pain flashed across Margaret's face. In California. I didn't know. I swear it. James and we lost touch when I left. Family pressure. I should have tried harder to maintain contact. Should have known he'd need me someday. She wiped at her eyes. I failed him. Failed you. I can't undo that, but I wanted you to know you have family who aren't monsters, who are proud of the man you're becoming. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Sawyer has established herself well in Sacramento, runs a successful millinery shop. She's offered to help with Jude's education, if you're amenable. I don't need, Jude started, but Margaret interrupted gently. It's not charity. It's penance. Maybe, or just an aunt wanting to do something for her nephew, even if it's years too late. She looked at Thomas. Judge Harrison told me what you did, taking in a strange boy, fighting to protect him. You're the father James would have been, given the chance. They moved to the porch, where Thomas served coffee, and Margaret told stories of Jude's father as a young man, how he'd loved horses, just like Jude, how he'd stood up to Elias even as a boy, earning beatings for his defiance, how he'd met Jude's mother at a church social and been smitten from the first moment. He wrote me once, after you were born, Margaret said, smiling at Jude. Said you were the best thing he'd ever done. That holding you made every hardship worthwhile. As the morning wore on, the initial tension eased. Margaret was nothing like Elias, warm where he'd been cold, gentle where he'd been cruel. When she laughed at one of Jude's shy jokes, Thomas saw the boy relax incrementally. I should go, Margaret said finally, rising. I've taken enough of your time. But Jude, if you ever want to write, to know more about your father. She pressed a card into his hand. You'll always be welcome in California. Both of you, she added, looking at Thomas. After she left, Jude stood holding the photograph and business card, looking younger than he had in months. You all right? Thomas asked. I don't know. It's strange, having family that isn't... He gestured helplessly. That isn't him. Family's what you make it. Thomas said, blood's just the starting point. She seems genuine, but you don't owe her anything. Not forgiveness, not connection, nothing. Your choice all the way. They returned to their work, but Thomas noticed Jude tucking the photograph carefully into his shirt pocket. That evening, as they mended harnesses in the barn, Jude brought it up again. Do you think I should write to her? What does your gut tell you? Jude considered. That she's not lying, that she really did love my father. That maybe knowing her would be like knowing a piece of him. Then write, see what comes of it. Just remember, you've got family here regardless. That won't change. The next weeks brought the full force of spring work. They repaired winter damage to the fences, helped with the neighboring ranch's brandings, prepared for the arrival of new stock Thomas had purchased with the improved finances. The ranch that had been dying was now thriving, requiring hired hands for the first time in years. One of those hands was Sam Chen's nephew, Daniel, a quiet young man who proved skilled with horses and patient with Jude's endless questions about the wider world. The other was Jake Thompson, an older cowhand with decades of experience and a gift for storytelling that made the long workdays pass quickly. "You've built something good here," Jake observed one evening as they watched Jude and Daniel working with the yearlings. "That boy's got a gift, and more than that, he's got heart. He saved me more than I saved him," Thomas admitted. "Gave me reason to keep going when I'd about given up. Way I heard it, you both saved each other. That's the best kind of family, the kind you choose and that chooses you back." Jude's education progressed rapidly under Reverend Morrison's tutelage. The boy devoured books, wrote essays that impressed even the well-educated Reverend, and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences. When the acceptance letter came from the Laramie Academy, no one was surprised. "I don't have to go," Jude said, reading the letter for the 10th time. The ranch needs you to become everything you can be." Thomas interrupted. "That might mean college, might mean coming back here with new ideas, might mean something else entirely. But you won't know unless you try." They were interrupted by riders approaching. Sheriff Watson and 2 men in federal marshal badges. Thomas tensed, but Watson's expression was pleased rather than grim. "Afternoon. Thomas, Jude, these men have ridden up from Kansas. Seems young Jude here has more rewards coming," the older marshal, a weathered man named Garrett, explained. "Elias Thornton's arrest led us to a rustling ring that's been plaguing 3 states. His testimony, trying to reduce his sentence, gave us names and locations. We've made over a dozen arrests. The reward money's substantial," the younger marshal added. "Enough to pay for a university education and then some." Jude looked stunned. "But I didn't do anything, just tried to stay alive." "Sometimes that's enough," Garrett said. "Your courage in standing up to him, Mr. Avery's determination to protect you, it started a chain of events that's made a lot of folks' lives better. That's worth recognizing." After they left, Thomas and Jude sat on the porch in the gathering dusk. The ranch spread before them, peaceful in the evening light. Cattle grazed in the distance. The new horses moved in the corral, and from the bunkhouse came the sound of Daniel's harmonica. "It doesn't feel real," Jude said. "A year ago, I was sleeping in barns, stealing eggs to survive. Now I have a father, a home, friends, a future I never dreamed of." "You earned it all," Thomas said, "with courage and character and stubborn refusal to let hardship break you. I learned from you. You could have sent me away that first day. Could have decided I was too much trouble when Elias came calling, but you didn't. Best decision I ever made." Thomas smiled. "Well, second best. Marrying Sarah was the first, but taking you in, that brought me back to life." Jude was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the education fund idea, for kids who've had hard times. What if we use Thornton's land money and part of the reward to start it properly? Call it the James and Mary Thornton Memorial Fund. Honor my real parents, not him." "That's a fine idea. Turn something ugly into something beautiful. Your parents would be proud." As full darkness fell, they could see lights beginning to twinkle across the valley, the Bancroft place, where Timothy was probably studying for his own academy exams. The Chen Ranch, where Sam and his family were building their American dream. The Morrison spread, where old Pete told his stories to anyone who'd listen. "Pa?" Jude said, using the title that now came as naturally as breathing. "Thank you for everything, for taking a chance on a half-dead boy who looked like a ghost from your past." "Thank you," Thomas replied, "for being brave enough to trust a broken-down rancher who'd forgotten how to hope." They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son not by blood, but by choice, looking out over the land that had brought them together. The Wyoming wind carried the sounds of their thriving ranch, their helpful neighbors, their chosen family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Jude would leave for school in the fall. The ranch would continue to grow. Life would move forward as it always did. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. A man who'd thought his heart buried had found it could still love. A boy who'd known only cruelty had discovered kindness and belonging. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, looking down on a small ranch where two souls had saved each other. It was, Thomas thought, exactly the kind of story Sarah would have loved, not because it was easy or painless, but because in the end, love won. Love always won, if you gave it the chance. "Come on," he said finally, standing and stretching. "Early day tomorrow. Those new horses won't train themselves." "Yes, sir," Jude said, grinning as he stood. "Though I bet I can have that roan saddle broke before you finish with the bay." "You're on, son. Loser makes breakfast for a week." They walked toward the house together, still debating the terms of their wager, their laughter carrying across the peaceful valley behind them. The fence where it all began stood straight and strong, no longer a boundary but a bridge between past sorrow and present joy. The empty ranch had become a home. The grieving man had become a father again. The frightened boy had become a confident young man. And in the vast Wyoming territory, under an endless canopy of stars, their unlikely family stood as proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as desperate strangers at our gates, asking only for the chance to belong.